Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We are currently reading The Island by T.M. Wright, and this week we are beginning Chapter 9. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy the story. Chapter 9. Harry Stans shook Pete Meyer, Jr. until the young boy woke, blinked at him, and grumbled in the cold darkness. "Who's that?" Harry said. "It's me, boy. Where's your ma at?" Pete Jr. shook his head, grabbed the top of his heavy blanket covering him, and pulled it back up to his neck. "Geez, Harry, I don't know." "She ain't in the house, Pete. Tell me where she is." "Damn it, Harry." "Don't you say damn it to me, boy. You're just 6 years old, and you don't say damn it to nobody. Now, you just tell me where your ma is at, and we won't have no trouble." Pete sighed. "She went out the back door. I heard her go out the back door. I ain't 6, Harry. I'm 7, and I'm gonna go to school, and I can say damn it whenever I want. My ma said so." Harry sniffed. "Geez, boy, what'd you do? Did you crap in your damn pants?" "I ain't crapped in my pants, Harry. I braked wind, and it ain't none of your business." Harry laughed quickly, sarcastically. He had never gotten along with Pete Jr. He'd always seen him as a barrier between himself and Lynette, even when Pete Sr. was alive. "And where'd you learn that?" "My ma told me to say it. She said fart ain't a good word to say." Harry straightened. "Your ma's got a screw loose somewheres, boy." "No, she ain't, and I'm gonna tell her you said that, Harry." Pete Jr. rolled over and pulled the heavy blanket up so it covered his head. Harry Stans said, his voice a hard whisper, "You ain't gonna tell her no damn thing, Pete, okay?" Pete Jr. said nothing. "Okay?" Harry demanded, his voice hard and threatening. "No," grunted Pete. "I ain't gonna say nothing." "Good. Now you told me your ma went out the back door. When was that?" "Damn it, I don't know. I was sleeping, Harry. I don't feel so good." Harry harumphed. "If you was sleeping, boy, then how in the hell do you know she went out the damn door?" "'Cause she woke me up. I know, 'cause she woke me up. Shit, she got Pa's axe out of the closet and she woke me up." On still, cloudless nights in January, Seventh Lake was flat and dark, and the sky overhanging it a dull gray blue from the starlight. It was a sky that was alive, a sky that breathed, and Lynette always told herself that she would surely be able to see by its light. But it was never so, unless there was a moon. Tonight, there was no moon. Tonight, she was blind except when she looked into the thin, flat ice near shore and saw the smeary reflection of bright stars in it. And when she brought Pete's axe down hard into the ice, the black water bubbled up from beneath, overflowed the ragged hole she'd made, and she smiled. Sound on such nights as this carried clearly and well, so when Harry Stans came out of the back door of Lynette's cottage, he heard the quick, brittle noise that Pete's axe made when it hit the ice, and he started down the steep path which led to the lake. The path was clear of snow, but Harry found that he had to move very slowly on it to keep from catching his foot on a frozen clod of earth and pitching forward. He guessed that Lynette was close to where the path ended, and he guessed also, from the noise he was hearing, that she was chopping at the ice. He called, "What you doing, Lynette?" and smiled to himself, as if at a private joke. She made no reply, and he realized he had not called out loudly enough, that he had actually not wanted her to hear him, that he wanted to surprise her in this strange thing she was doing. "Hey, what you up to there? Why the hell you chopping a hole in the ice? If you got some kind of problem, then you'd best talk about it with someone who'll listen." His heels hit a small patch of ice, and he sat down hard on a fist-sized rock. He let out a loud whoop of pain, scrambled to his feet, and turned around so he was facing up the slope with his hands on the path and his knees bent. He moved this way down the slope for a few moments. Then he stopped. He could still hear the brittle noises of the axe hitting the ice, and he realized that he was close enough to Lynette that she had surely heard him cry out. Why, then, hadn't she stopped chopping at the ice? Why hadn't she called to him, or at least stopped what she was doing and listened? He considered this question for a few moments and decided that he had cried out just as the axe had hit the ice, and so she had actually not heard him. He continued backing down the slope. When he got to the bottom, where the path terminated at a foot-high drop-off to the beach, he straightened and turned to face the lake. He could hear the axe hitting the ice rhythmically every 5 seconds or so, but when he looked toward the sound, he could see nothing against the black backdrop of the beach. Although Lynette was close enough to him, he guessed, that he would not have to raise his voice to be heard by her. But he said nothing. In time, he thought, his eyes would adjust. He heard the axe head bite into the ice over and over again. He stared hard toward the source of the noise, and he thought once that, yes, he could see something fluttering there, like a moth in a dark window, that it was Lynette. A part of her, anyway, her arm raising up, and he realized in the next moment that his eyes were merely manufacturing it, and he was seeing nothing. He stepped down from the foot-high drop-off and moved a few steps over the snow-covered sand, heard it crunch underfoot. Then he stopped. He realized at last that Lynette had been moving away from him all this time, that she was now twice as far from him as she'd been when he had reached the bottom of the slope. "Lynette, what you doing down there?" he called. He got no answer, so he called again, more loudly. "Lynette, honey, what you doing down there?" He got no answer. "Damn it, you answer me!" He listened. He could not hear the axe biting into the ice. "Lynette?" he said. Moments later, she moved past him, toward the slope that led to her cottage. "Lynette?" he said, going after her. He got no answer. "Lynette!" Still, he got no answer. "Damn it, woman!" He tripped on a clod of earth, fell face forward, absorbed the impact with his hands, scrambled up, looked frantically about as he brushed the snow off. Lynette was nowhere in sight. History, September 14th, 1976. Anita Mosiman and her daughter Catherine were having a picnic in a clearing at the center of Dog Island. It was dusk. The air was unusually warm and moist for mid-September, the sky a bright blue-orange. The whisper of a breeze caused an occasional flip-flop of light and shadow in the trees that circled the clearing. Anita Mosiman passed a pear to Catherine, who was very fond of pears. Anita said, nodding to indicate their surroundings, "It's very nice here. It makes me feel good." Catherine said, "It makes me think of Uncle Harry." "What makes you think of Uncle Harry?" "This island we live on, Mama." She pursed her lips, clearly annoyed at her mother's ignorance. Anita smiled. "Why Uncle Harry? I don't understand." Catherine took a huge bite of the pear. It was very ripe and full of juice. Some of the juice slid down her chin. "He used to hug me. He hugged me all the time." "And?" Anita coaxed. "And?" said Catherine, chewing the bite of pear. "What you mean? And how does that remind you of this island?" Catherine answered, shrugging. "I feel like it's hugging me, that's all." Anita nodded. "Oh," she said. A honeybee buzzed over, hovered near an open jar of mustard for a moment, then flew away. "That sounds pleasant." "Uh-huh," Catherine said, "but I didn't like it." "You didn't like Uncle Harry's hugs?" Catherine grinned. "That's funny, Uncle Harry's hugs. It's funny. It sounds like you're talking about those little drinks you get at the store." She had a sharp, almost nasal voice that Anita hoped she'd grow out of. "Uncle Harry's hugs. That's funny, Mama." She laughed. It was quick, high-pitched, vaguely forced. "Okay," said Anita. There were times when she found her daughter's sense of humor annoying, very funny. Catherine's laughter subsided slowly. She took another bite of the pear. She said, juice squirting from the sides of her mouth as she spoke, "Because he hugged too hard, Mama." "Hugged too hard?" Catherine nodded. "Uh-huh. He hurt me sometimes, but I didn't say nothing. I didn't want to hurt his feelings." "That was thoughtful of you, dear," Anita said. "But in a case like that, where you're actually getting hurt, I'd say—" "Sometimes," Catherine interrupted. She interrupted quite a lot. Anita tried to ignore it because it was clear that there were many things happening in her daughter's head, and so it was understandable if, from time to time, she was oblivious to what others were saying. "When I'm in my bed at night, Mama, it feels like I'm being hugged real hard, almost so I can't breathe, almost." Anita was concerned. Was her daughter having some sort of respiratory difficulty? Something to do with the island's high humidity? Perhaps she had caught her brother's flu. "Does this happen often, dear?" Catherine nodded, studied her pear, which was half devoured, and said, "All the time, Mama. Especially at night, I guess. And Max says it happens to him, too." "He does?" Catherine nodded enthusiastically. "Sometimes it sounds like he can't breathe at all, Mama, like there's something in his throat, and I get scared, and I call over to him to stop it." Anita studied her daughter a few moments, thinking that she might be playing another of her jokes, which were often grim. She decided, at last, that Catherine was being completely serious. She buttered a piece of her homemade 7-grain bread, offered it to Catherine, who shook her head and said, "No thanks, Mama, I'm real full." Took a bite of it anyway, and set it on her paper plate. They had lain a seldom-used quilt down as a blanket. It was a patchwork of many bright colors that had been given to the family by Ben's grandmother. Anita watched as an impossibly large ant made its way across one of the cream-colored squares, its dead companion in tow. She reached down, flicked both ants off the quilt with her finger, and said to Catherine, "I really think that something of such importance that you should have shared it with your father and me, Catherine." Again Catherine shrugged. She shrugged quite a lot, Anita thought. "It ain't," she began. "It's not, Catherine. Don't use the word ain't," Anita cut in. "Not ain't, okay?" "Sure, Mama." "You were saying? Can I have another pear?" "I thought you were full." "I am, but I want another pear. Pears aren't like food or nothing." "Or anything, not nothing. Anything. Can I?" Anita sighed, reached into the picnic basket, withdrew another pear, and gave it to her daughter. Catherine took a big bite and said as she chewed, "It's not important, Mama, because it ain't nothing wrong with him. It's this island we live on." Chapter 10. History. Early Autumn, 1976. Ben Mosiman remembered moving into the house and being afraid. It had been a nebulous fear. Its only basis was in the fact that the house was new to him, and he had no idea of its personality or of the ghosts that might inhabit it. Old houses had ghosts. It was a given. But he did not believe much in ghosts. He believed in his capacity to be made fearful, and he respected it. He knew that it was something immature in him, something that harkened way, way back, but he had never been able to shake it, so he'd stopped trying. He'd lived in a number of houses, and his fear of them had always dissipated before long, as it did with the house on Dog Island. Soon he came to know it well. He came to know that it was simply an old house with few secrets, and that the secrets it did have were probably not very interesting. He knew that. He sensed it. Over time, instead, he became fearful of the island. That was a fear which he tried to shake because, he told himself, there was no basis for it. Not in his childhood, and not in his imagination. It was only an island, and it had no personality, no life of its own, no secrets. But it probably did have secrets, he decided. It had age, and so it had a past, and so secrets. But it could not harbor them, it could not keep them, as a house could. He once said to Anita, when they had been at the island for a month and were beginning to settle into a routine, "I don't like to walk on the island, but I do it anyway." She gave him a small, confused grin. "What does that mean?" "Only what I said. There is no other place to walk but on the island, so it's where I walk, but I don't like to do it." "You could get in a boat and go to shore. You could walk there." He shook his head. "Too much trouble." "Well, it's a nice island," she said. "It's pleasant." Again he shook his head. "It's not pleasant." "I think it's very pleasant. So do the children. They love it." "It's not pleasant, Anita. It's not nice. It's scary," he wanted to say, but was afraid of her reaction. And he didn't know what he meant either, because the island was pleasant. He knew what she was talking about. He said, "Do you like it? Do you take walks here?" She gave him another confused look. "We walk together, Ben." "Well, yeah, but that's different." She nodded. "I understand that, I guess." "When you're alone, it's very different than when you're walking with someone, Anita." "Ben, I agree. I said that I agree." "When you're alone, you become more self-involved. You become more defensive, too, but the irony is that you open yourself up as well. Your senses become heightened because you're on the defensive, of course. It's a lousy trade-off. You want to be relaxed and comfortable, and you become defensive, and that makes you vulnerable." "To what?" "To anything." "You're being very cryptic, Ben." "The island." Again, he didn't say it. "The island?" she coaxed. But he never told her. The island's effect intrigued him, because something of a mystery titillated him, and he left the house often to walk. There were paths on the island that had been laid down decades earlier by previous owners and their visitors. These paths traversed several acres of fields, meandered through woods, and then circled back on themselves. Ben quickly found that if he started off on any path, it eventually led back to its beginning. He saw wildlife on his walks on the island. There were birds, a hawk, several owls, grackles, starlings, and also an abundance of field mice and squirrels. And there were 2 feral cats who dogged him, appearing now and then very briefly, eyes intent on him, wildly and quietly curious. One cat was very large, the size of a small dog, and the other was medium-sized and muscular, its square head appearing much too big for its body. They were orange tabbies, and even from a distance, as they scooted off with their tails high, as if in imitation of white-tailed deer, it was clear that they were male. It was no great feat for Ben to realize that they were cats which had once been owned by people who had lived at the house. He enjoyed watching them, enjoyed their eyes on him because they showed him intentions which he could understand. He could not understand the island's intentions. Once he had tried calling to the cats, had tried coaxing them to him with, "Here, kitty, 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 kitty." He soon decided that these tough guys were far beyond such pretty nonsense, and that if he actually did succeed in getting them within arm's reach, they'd doubtless quickly draw blood and scoot off. He'd had experience with feral cats as a child. There were 3-inch-long scars on his left forearm to prove it. He named the cats Heckle and Jekyll, and he called to them several times on his walks. "Heckle, Jekyll, where are you?" They appeared soon enough, eyes intent on him, bodies low, in the cat crouch. He walked mostly in open fields, knees rising up over the tops of the waist-high grasses so he could negotiate the tall clods of earth that were everywhere, pushed up by field mice and moles. The island was very warm and humid in summer, and though the wooded areas were cooler, they made him afraid, so he went to them only on the last few 100 feet of his walks on his way back to the house. After 6 or 7 weeks, his fear of the island changed. He continued to be afraid of it, but he grew to believe that he understood it, too, as if it actually were an entity to understand, like an eccentric uncle, a grumpy brother-in-law, even the dark side of himself. He thought he understood that the island was in pain. He had no clear reason to believe this, only the fact that pain caused just such feelings in himself as he was sensing from the island, a grasping, self-protective stasis, immobility. Once he said to Anita, "What do you think of the idea that the island is alive?" She gave him a philosophical answer. "How can anyone say it isn't, or that the air and the water aren't? We have a very narrow view of what the word alive means." That didn't satisfy him. He said, "That's not what I meant." She cocked her head. "Oh? I meant it literally." "So did I." He shook his head. "You didn't mean it the same way I did. I'm sorry." "For what?" "For nothing. For disagreeing. But we don't disagree. We agree. The island is alive, just as we are, just as the air and the water are." He understood then. She simply could not grasp the real meaning of his question. Even if he explained it to her, she would not grasp it because it was something she did not feel the way he did. And she did not feel it, he guessed, because she was not as perceptive as he, and never had been. Her perceptions were for her children, to know when they were troubled, or in the first stages of illness, to know when to leave them alone, and when to go to them with her arms wide. She had no real perception of anything else, not even of him. She put up with him because she told herself that she loved him and needed him, but it wasn't true, and he knew it. She loved her children and her father. She tolerated her husband. She talked with him and laughed with him and slept with him, but he was merely a companion whom she did not love. His perceptions were different, he told himself, and that was why the island talked to him. It was a phrase he first used when he had been at the island for 3 months and had come in from a walk to find the house empty. A note left on the kitchen table explained that the rest of the family had gone into Eagle Bay to shop. It was the first time he had been on the island alone, the first time he had been unable to get off it, in fact, and he was very afraid. He closed all the shades, drew all the curtains. He was shutting himself away from the island, shutting himself up inside his house, inside himself. The island spoke to him before long. It spoke to him in low, hoarse whispers, as if it could speak no louder. He told himself that it was telling him of its pain, telling him it was uncertain how to react to the trespassers on it, to him and his wife and his children and his wife's father. He did not try to speak back to the island because he heard only a constant, low monologue from it, and he had no chance to interrupt. He sat quietly in his big red winged-back chair in the living room, with the shades drawn and the smell of the lake wafting in on a breeze that pushed through the screen door at the back of the kitchen. And he listened to the island talk. Late September was dreary and cold, and he fancied that the island stopped talking to him. He was happy for that at first, and he made his walks, under almost constantly overcast skies, longer than usual, because, for the first time in quite a long time, he had only his own thoughts to deal with. He also tried to get closer to Heckle and Jekyll. He supposed that the coming winter might kill them unless they and he established a sort of gruff but friendly relationship. But they would have no more to do with him than when they had first encountered him. They kept a respectable distance, bouncing off when he got to within 20 or 30 feet. He got close enough once, though, to see that the smaller of the two, Jekyll, had sustained an awful injury to its eye. Perhaps, Ben guessed, Jekyll had tangled with one of the owls that live on the island, or with the hawk. When he again got close enough to see Jekyll's eye, 2 weeks later, he saw that it had healed dramatically, and he muttered something about the miraculous healing powers of cats. He decided during that autumn that the island had stopped talking to him because it had simply gone to sleep. If it actually was a living thing, then surely it would want to hide from the awful cold of an Adirondack winter. January 17th. Arnaud said to Lynette Meyer, "I'm sorry, Lynette, but expectancy of work for you here is 0. She had worked at the inn as a housekeeper several times during its summer seasons. Arnaud went on, "You've haphazardly walked mid-coldness in these trying times without much fortune." He smiled in apology. "Am I clear?" He didn't wait for answer. A phone call in the intermittent. "Phone's disconnected," Lynette said. "I saw you was open. I came over." "Sure, he's got work for you," I said. Arnaud frowned. It was clear to him that she needed his help. He stood from his desk chair, came around, put his hand on her shoulder. "We're open now, what, no more than January and February? No longer, and there is abandonment almost here besides, only 16 guests, and there is Mr. Carden, the caretaker, and the cook, and then I do all the cleaning, which is not much, a sheet here, a pillowcase here, a floor to be swept." He shook his head. "Please accept my forgiveness. I will drive you back, at least." Lynette shook her head. "No, I don't mind walking. I know you got work to do." "This morning I have snow to push and, which will wait, as it always has." "I can do that. I can shovel snow." Arnaud sighed. He knew that if he offered Lynette a job, it would not only be temporary, it would be very close to charity as well, and that was a precedent he did not want to set. To say nothing of the fact that he could ill afford to hire her, he said, "You have a child?" Lynette nodded sullenly. "A child at home, and one at the hospital in Eagle Bay." "A hospital?" Arnaud said. It was not a question, but Lynette said, "She was real sick. She's better now, though. She'll be back with me in the spring." "It is my hope," Arnaud said, feeling suddenly helpless in the face of Lynette's misery. "Real sick," Lynette repeated. "She 'bout died, in fact, and we took her in the ambulance to the hospital, and she 'bout died there, too. But she's better now, and she'll come out of that hospital in the spring, and please, can I have a job? I'll work cheap. I'll work real cheap. I'll work for my dinner, and that's all, if you let me come work here." "I can give you more than that," Arnaud said, trying at the same time to figure out how. Lynette smiled at him. "You offering me a job, then?" Arnaud hesitated. Yes, he realized he was offering her a job. He said, "I'm offering you what I can, Lynette. A room, meals." "When?" Arnaud realized that her mood had changed suddenly from one of pleading to one of insistence, and it annoyed him. He shook his head quickly, in agitation. "When is soon, perhaps? Maybe Thursday." "Good, Thursday." He looked at her a moment. She was slightly shorter than he, but she stood before him now so resolutely, with such an aura of power about her, that she looked taller. "Yes," he said. "In the afternoon. I will pick you up in the afternoon." "No need. I have a friend. He'll drive my boy and me." "Your boy?" "Tomorrow. My boy and me will come tomorrow. We'll be here in the afternoon. Thank you." And she turned and left the office. History, October 12th, 1976. The Mosimans were having a picnic at the center of Dog Island when a storm came up. It heralded itself in much the way that most such storms did. The horizon darkened, and the lake grew quiet, and whatever boats were out headed for home. Minutes before the storm struck, Ben Mosiman offered that the sky looks threatening, sure, but it doesn't mean a whole lot. I have a sense of these things. So the family stayed at their picnic site, certain, anyway, that if a storm did strike, the close, crowded pines would shelter them as they made their way to the house. They were right about that, though Ben, with little Catherine tucked under his arm as if he were a father bird sheltering his young, repeated again and again all the way back, "So I was wrong, sue me." And they clambered into the house and settled down in front of a big window in the living room that overlooked the lake and gave them a wondrous view of the storm unfolding. Max proclaimed loudly, to be heard above the noise of the storm, "That's just lightning, and it ain't gonna hurt me in here," which was a 180-degree turnaround from the way he'd felt about storms only a year earlier. Catherine was entranced by the storm. She sat quietly on her father's lap, with her gray eyes wide and her mouth open. Anita's father sat nearby with a stunned look on his old face. He was remembering similar storms from his childhood before he'd gone deaf, remembering the racket they'd made and the thrill they'd given him. Now, because his eyes were failing, he saw little more than a flurry of gray and foam in front of the window, as if he were watching laundry turn in a washing machine. It was Anita who felt the stilt at the back of the house crack. She turned to Ben, sitting beside her, and said, "Ben, did you feel that?" He glanced at her. "Sure," he said, unconcerned. "It was a wave hitting the bottom of the house. Haven't you felt that before?" She thought a moment and said, "Yeah," paused and went on. "That's all it was? Are you sure?" He answered, "That's all it was. Trust me." Chapter 11, January 18th. A heavy snow fell on the evening of January 17th, so the following morning Arnaud got his guests together for a morning of group skiing. Everyone was pleased. Mitzi Roman grumbled that it was about time, a sentiment shared by more than a few of the other 12 guests. 2 couples scheduled to arrive had canceled. Snowfall had been unseasonably light, and their days of skiing had been few. But Mitzi cheerfully got into her ski clothes, collected her skis and poles, and was the first one waiting outside the registration area, where Arnaud had asked them to gather after they had all enjoyed a hearty breakfast in the main dining room. Amy Glynn was next, her infant daughter Samantha very warmly bundled up on her back. Amy took several long draughts of the frigid morning air and exclaimed, "Nothing like the cold to make you feel alive." Mitzi Roman echoed that sentiment, though not as enthusiastically. It was a sunny morning, the sky a shallow, pale blue, a winter sky, and the snowfall the previous evening had left a good 8 inches of fluff on the ground. "It really is very beautiful here, don't you think, Mrs. Roman?" Amy said. "It's nice," Mitzi agreed. Walt Roman appeared then from the cabin he and Mitzi shared. He was wearing a red ski jacket, baggy brown pants, black ski mittens, and a blue and white knitted cap, and he lumbered toward them down the snow-covered wooden walkway that followed the lake shore, skis in one hand, poles in the other. When he saw his wife and Amy Glynn, he lifted a ski pole and yelled, "Mornin'!" Mitzi could see that he was smiling, and it pleased her. This was only his second winter of cross-country skiing, and she knew that he would never quite get the hang of it. Like Arnaud's lopsided way with the language, Walt had a lopsided and ungraceful way with his feet and legs. Walking was fine, but pushing himself along on 2 slippery rails was another matter entirely. He accomplished it by moving one leg only, usually his left, while pushing himself along with the ski pole in his opposite hand. Mitzi thought that this was a comical way to ski. She'd been skiing since she was a child, but she knew that despite his lack of grace and the inevitable exhaustion, Walt enjoyed the hell out of it, so she said nothing. Jeff Glynn was the next to appear. He and Amy wore matching ski clothes, blue parkas, white pants, red ski mittens, and brand new Aladdin skis. His were gray, hers blue. Jeff smiled feebly, nodded, and explained that he'd had a touch of indigestion, but it was over now, and he was ready to ski. He'd done very little cross-country skiing, mostly downhill skiing. It was, he went on, much more challenging than cross-country, to which Walt Roman responded with a belly chuckle. "Son," he exclaimed, "I can barely walk and chew gum at the same time, so cross-country skiing is a real challenge for me." Mitzi said, "Don't let him fool you, Mr. Glynn. He's very coordinated, despite his size." "I'm sure he is," said Amy Glynn with a polite smile. Samantha gave a squawk then, and Amy positioned herself so Jeff could get a look at the child. "She's lost her pacifier, Jeff," Amy explained. "Uh-huh," Jeff said. "You're right." Found the pacifier in the folds of the infant carrier and put it back in his daughter's mouth. Within moments, the child was sucking noisily at it. Jeff said to Amy, "Did you give her morning feeding, Amy?" "Of course I did, Jeff," she answered. Mitzi Roman said, "You're breastfeeding, aren't you, dear?" She had seen Samantha being breastfed in a corner of the dining room earlier that morning. Mitzi concluded, "I think it's wonderful." Walt Roman attempted a cheerful smile at this, to match the mood of the morning, but as far as he was concerned, breastfeeding was a distinctly private matter, and women who did it in public were simply inviting the stares of strangers. A newlywed couple named King appeared from the inside exit, followed by an older couple named Westlake, who were laughing together as if at a private joke, and then Muriel Fox came out of the door of the reception area. She had ski poles in one hand, skis in the other, and a brown wicker picnic basket hanging from her back like a backpack, wide leather straps tied under her arms and over her shoulders. She gave the group a bright smile, her dark eyes sparkling. "Wonderful morning," she chirped. "A simply wonderful morning." "Nothing like the cold to make you feel alive," exclaimed Amy Glenn. Muriel said, "You bringing the baby?" There was a tinge of concern in her tone. "Yes," said Amy, "she'll be fine. My mother used to do the same thing with me. Not that I remember it, of course." "She did," Jeff Glynn offered, then explained as if in apology. "Samantha's bundled up well, and besides, she gets a lot of heat from Amy." "Of course," said Muriel Fox, still smiling, though clearly unconvinced. She glanced about. "Is this all of us?" As she said it, a tall, thin man named Fred Armstrong came out the same door that the Kings and the Westlakes had come out of. He was followed by a chubby, middle-aged couple with round, red faces and cheery smiles. "Where's Arnaud?" said Walt Roman. "Where's the lady in the middle cabin, too?" said Mitzi Roman. "The one whose brother had the accident." "I believe her name is Jean Ward," Jeff said. "Yeah," said Mitzi Roman. "Miss Ward." Amy Glynn asked, "How is her brother, anyway?" There was silence all around for a few moments. Then Jeff Glynn said, "I hear he's going to be fine. A touch of hypothermia, but he'll be fine." "I'm glad," said Muriel Fox. "Lord knows this damned lake has claimed too many people already." "Oh?" said Jeff Glynn. "Has it really?" asked Fred Armstrong. "Too many," Muriel repeated. Arnaud appeared then, from the same door that Muriel had come out of, his 7-foot-long, powder-blue track skis preceding him. He stopped halfway through the door and squinted into the bright sky. "Pleasant surprises," he murmured. "Cold, snow, and sun." "Is Miss Ward going to come along with us?" Mitzi Roman asked. "I don't know," Arnaud answered. "She was missing at breakfast." "Missing at breakfast?" said Walt Roman. Muriel said, "Here she comes," and pointed toward the walkway, where Jean Ward had just come out of her cabin and was making her way quickly toward them. She already had her skis on, and, as Walt Roman had done, she raised one of her poles and called, "Mornin'!" Nearly as one, the group called, "Good morning," back to her, and within minutes all had their skis on and had started across the snow-covered parking lot. Walt Roman struggled mightily at the rear of the group to get the same tenuous feel for what he was doing that he'd had the last time he'd been out, a couple of days earlier. At Route 43, which led into Eagle Bay, they hesitated. The ski trails Arnaud had laid out for them started at the other side of the road, crossed nearly a mile of open field, then snaked through several miles of pine forest, through another mile of open field, more forest, and, at least, doubled back on itself so their journey ended where it had begun. Arnaud explained, before they crossed the road, "We are taking turns in the picnic basket. Muriel is first, then I am second, then I am propositioning volunteers beyond that, deleting, of course, Mrs. Glenn, who supports her daughter all the way." Everyone in the group understood this, and arrangements were made for Jeff Glynn to take the picnic basket third, followed by Toby King, and then Jean Ward. Finally, Arnaud said, "Quiet now," listening hard for the sound of traffic on the snow-covered road. It curved sharply only 100 yards east. Then, with a dramatic wave toward the open field, called, "We're off!" And moments later, they were moving with varying degrees of grace and speed over the field, through the deep, fluffy snow, their breaths exploding into mist in the frigid air, their faces red from the cold and the exertion, their mouths drawn into flat smiles of pleasure. History, October 26, 1976. Ben Mosiman was on his way back to his house on Dog Island in his 12-foot green aluminum boat when the motor cut out and would not restart. There were oars in the boat, and Ben reluctantly began rowing to the island, which was still a good half-mile off. The afternoon was chilly, the sky overcast with billowy gray clouds, but there was, strangely, no wind. He was dressed warmly, and the only discomfort he felt was the rough oar handles. The grain had risen from the surrounding wood against his palms and fingers. Within minutes, blisters started. He had been to this post office in Eagle Bay to mail a package of Adirondack-made products to his parents. This included jams and jellies, some cheeses, several small wooden toys, and half a dozen chocolates. He had no specific reason for sending the gift. It was not his parents' anniversary, and it was no one's birthday. The package was merely something he had seen a couple of weeks earlier at an Eagle Bay gift shop, and had decided it was something his parents would appreciate. He got to Eagle Bay in the family's 5-year-old Buick wagon, which he kept parked in a rented garage half a mile from the Many Pines Inn. He had been over 3 months at the house that October, and this was the first time he'd had to row the boat. He was not accustomed to rowing. The last time he'd done it had been as a child, on a fog-shrouded lake in Maine, but he told himself that there was no real trick to it. All that it required was perseverance, ease of motion, and timing. He rowed with his back to the bow, so he had to glance around every now and then to be certain he was still headed for Dog Island. His view of the island was good. He could see his house, the boat dock, the half-circle of pine trees behind the house. At one point, when he glanced around, he even saw a face at one of the second-floor windows. He supposed that it was Catherine's face, because her room was there, and he knew that Max was out with his grandfather on a walking tour of the island. Ben took his hand from the right oar and waved. The face in the window disappeared. He reached for the oar. The handle had drifted toward the front of the boat when he'd let go of it. He grabbed the oar part way down the shaft, shifted his grip to the handle, and began rowing again, slowly, with perseverance, letting the oars come up out of the water on the backstroke and dip straight in on the forward stroke. It seemed right. After what seemed many minutes, he glanced around, expecting to find the boat dock very near, but it seemed to be at the same distance as when the motor had stopped. He cursed and told himself that this task of rowing was too much like work, that it made mere seconds seem like minutes. He stopped rowing for a few moments, oars held up 6 inches from the surface of the water. The boat swung slowly around so its stern faced the island. He told himself that the island was not just as far away as when the motor had stopped. That was impossible. Clearly, the problem was that distances were awfully hard to judge over water. What seemed like a half-mile could easily be much more. He began rowing again, at first faster, more furiously. He stopped this after a few seconds, realizing it was an approach that was all wrong, that it would soon lead to exhaustion, and, because a wind had come up, that it could get him into lots of trouble if a storm were brewing. He rowed with a slow and deliberate rhythm and glanced back at the house often to be sure of his approach. After several minutes, he stopped again and let the boat's stern swing around so it faced the island. He was farther off. He was certain of it. But, he guessed, looking over his shoulder, he was no closer to the mainland either. Perhaps he was being swept laterally away from the island, so his movement was parallel to both the island and the mainland. He peered over the side of the boat, thinking he might see the swirling movement of a whirlpool or the rush of a current, but the clear gray-blue water had only a slight ripple on it from the wind. He looked at the house for a long while, hoping to see what he had assumed was his daughter's face reappear in the second-floor window, but the windows remained blank. He called, "Anita! Anita! Are you there?" He supposed that she could hear him, even over such a distance, even over the wind, too, which was gathering in intensity, pushing the tops of the pine trees near the house. But she did not appear. He began to row again. He said to himself, "Now, don't panic. That would be stupid." And though he rowed faster, he did not lose his timing. Gurgle, swish through the water, lift, return, gurgle, swish, lift, return, and kept it up for 200 strokes, which, he estimated, would equal a good 8 or 10 minutes that, in turn, should take him perhaps a quarter-mile through the water, considering an average speed of 2 or 3 miles an hour. He looked over his shoulder at the house. He was no closer to it, nor was he closer to the mainland. He shook his head. He grinned, suddenly nervous and confused. Obviously, he was caught in some kind of freakish current. Obviously, what he should do was row back toward the mainland and see if that would get him out of it. "That's a good idea," he whispered, and turned the boat around so its bow was facing the mainland. He rowed again, slowly, methodically, and he saw quickly enough that he was getting farther from the island, closer to the mainland. He stopped rowing. He smiled, pleased. Surely he was out of the freakish current now, but the smart thing would be to try and avoid it altogether. He angled the boat so its bow faced the eastern edge of the island. He began to row again. 5 minutes later, he stopped. He was getting no closer. He took a quick, agitated breath. This was getting stupid. "Damn it!" he hissed. "Anita!" he called. "Anita!" And he wondered what, should she appear, he would have her do. There was no second boat, though now he resolved that there should be. "Anita!" he called again, knowing that if he was indeed in trouble out here, then she would be able to radio for help on their CB. He called to her repeatedly over the space of several minutes, but she did not appear. At last, he started rowing toward the house again. On the island, Joe Archer and his grandson Max were on the last leg of a long walk. Joe was holding Max's hand, but it was Max who was leading, because his eyes were good, and Joe's eyes could show him only what was within swatting distance. Joe smiled as he walked because he imagined that the day was very warm, though it wasn't, and that the sun was shining brightly, though it was hidden behind a mantle of billowy gray clouds. Several times he had remarked to his grandson about what a warm and bright day it was, and Max had agreed because he knew that his grandfather was wishing or remembering, and that his senses weren't working right. Max loved his grandfather as much as he loved anyone. His grandfather needed him and loved him, and, best of all, treated him as something more than simply a nuisance. A small pond lay in a little hollow not far from the house. The pond was the summertime home for frogs, mosquitoes, and dragonflies, and it even sported a tiny growth of cattails. Joe Archer and his grandson stopped by the pond before heading home. To Joe, it looked like a huge and fuzzy gray mirror, and he said so to his grandson. Max said, "It's not a mirror, Grandpa. It's the pond." Joe nodded. "Yes, I know that, Max." Max picked up a small stone and threw it into the center of the pond. Then he picked up another and threw it so it hit near the edge. He enjoyed watching the ripples intersect without canceling each other. It gave him a strange feeling that he was seeing something very important. After several failed attempts to get closer to the island, Ben sat for a long while without moving. He decided he was waiting it out. It was the island, and it was keeping him away. It was spitting him out, throwing him to the fish. At last, he gave the outboard another try. It sputtered, as if on the verge of starting. He took the spark plug tap off, studied it closely, decided it was clean, put it back, tried the motor again. It sputtered once more, but it did not start. He tried it again and again, and then again. It started. Within minutes, he was home. Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you'll join us next week for another installment of The Island. And until then, have a great week, everyone.
Say goodbye to itching and stinging and swelling with B-Itch Stop, your all-natural solution for fast relief from bug bites and stings and skin irritations of all kinds. It's made right here in Nevada with safe, all-natural ingredients. Our formula is gentle enough for all ages and skin types. Whether it's mosquito bites, bee or wasp stings, spider bites, or even cactus thorns and poison ivy, B-Itch Stop works fast to soothe and calm your skin. Get yours today. And you know you can get it right here on our site at the store. Now you just go ahead and check that out. I swear by it myself. This is Clay Steele. Take care of yourself.